The Zorak Empire had crushed 100 worlds before setting their sights on Earth. Their fleets, vast and gleaming, hung in high orbit, their gunmetal hulls reflecting the pale blue glow of the planet below. To the warlords who led them, this was yet another conquest. Another primitive species to be brought to heel beneath the might of plasma and steel. Commander Varesh stood on the bridge of the Vindicator, his 4 eyes scanning the battle reports, streaming across the holo display. The humans had responded with the expected level of defiance, scrambling jet fighters and deploying ground forces, but their weaponry was as laughable as the war strategists had predicted. Projectile-based firearms, crude rocket systems, no energy-based armaments, no plasma shielding, no warp-capable vessels, a civilization still shackled by chemical combustion. Their arrogance is almost admirable, mused General Kordath, his scarred mandibles clicking in amusement. They see our forces and still believe they have a chance. Varesh nodded, though his amusement was tempered with the pragmatism that had kept him alive through 20 campaigns. Desperation often breeds irrational courage. We should expect some resistance before their inevitable collapse. It was the same pattern every time. A planet's defenders would hold the line for days, weeks at most, before their morale cracked. The Zorak, unchallenged in centuries, had come to see planetary invasions as little more than a formality. The first assault began with a precision strike on Earth's military satellites, blinding their intelligence networks. Orbital bombardments followed, targeting airbases and key infrastructure. Cities burned, armored convoys scattered under sustained plasma fire. The Zorak landing forces deployed in formation, their towering war machines cutting through human lines with ease. The warlords had little interest in wholesale extermination. Conquered species were more useful as labor forces, but resistance had to be crushed before negotiations could begin. Initial reports confirmed what the strategists had predicted. Human infantry was ineffective. Their small arms were unable to penetrate Zorak battle armor, their missiles too slow to bypass advanced countermeasures. Varesh had expected more. The humans had been spacefaring for decades, dabbling in artificial intelligence and genetic engineering. They had even constructed nuclear weapons, primitive but dangerous in the hands of a desperate species. And yet, they fought with nothing but bullets and explosives, as though they were still waging wars among themselves. We found no evidence of planetary defenses beyond conventional artillery, a lieutenant reported, his voice edged with disappointment. No mass driver systems, no orbital cannons, no advanced fortifications. Kordath scoffed. It's almost an insult. They might as well surrender now and save us the effort. But Varesh wasn't convinced. Primitive as their weapons were, the humans were fighting with a tenacity he had rarely seen. Their forces did not retreat in disarray as expected. They adapted. Even as their technology failed to match Zorak firepower, their strategy shifted with unsettling speed. Instead of engaging in direct combat, they lured Zorak squads into dense urban zones, using the terrain to nullify the advantage of superior armor. They turned wrecked cities into labyrinthine death traps, setting ambushes that claimed far more lives than Varesh deemed acceptable. And then there were the long-range strikes. Not from orbit, not from aircraft, from the ground. Varesh watched, the footage with growing unease. Human artillery fire had been dismissed as inconsequential, a relic of outdated warfare, yet here it was, causing unexpected disruption in Zorak formations. Explosions erupted with terrifying force, sending armored troops sprawling, their shields flickering and failing under the sheer kinetic impact. Entire platoons vanished beneath a storm of steel and fire, the kind of destruction that energy weapons rarely achieved. This is unconventional, Kordath admitted, his earlier confidence now strained. Varesh's 4 eyes narrowed. Unconventional. Warfare wins battles. The Zorak had never faced an enemy that relied on indirect fire to such devastating effect. Their own weapons were designed for overwhelming force, obliterating enemies in direct engagements. They had no doctrine for countering an enemy they could not see, could not hear, until it was too late. A transmission crackled through the command link, a distress call from the 12th Armored Division, stationed on what had been designated a low-threat battlefield. Enemy bombardment, shields failing, heavy casualties, tactical withdrawal, tactical withdrawal. Varesh's mandibles tightened. The Zorak did not withdraw. He turned to a junior officer. "What is their estimated firepower?" The officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "We're still analyzing, Commander, but these human artillery strikes exceed expected impact force. Their munitions appear to be—" He paused as though the words themselves defied logic. "Solid projectiles, but they are capable of penetrating our heaviest armor. Impossible. Plasma weapons melted through steel in seconds. Kinetic. Munitions were an outdated relic. There was no way a civilization still using gunpowder could pose a legitimate threat. And yet, they did." Varesh turned back to the holomap. "Where is the artillery positioned?" Another silence. The answer came, slowly, hesitantly. "We don't know." For the first time, real unease settled over the bridge. The Zorak Empire had never encountered an enemy whose primary weapon could not be found. Their sensors could detect energy discharges, plasma residue, radiation signatures. But human artillery? It was effectively invisible, just barrels of steel launching untraceable death across kilometers of battlefield. Kordath scowled. "Then we level every mountain, every valley, every city until we find them." Varesh remained silent, studying the data, searching for a pattern. The humans were not winning, yet. But they were bleeding the Zorak in ways no species had before. They had no energy shields, no plasma weapons, no starships that could challenge the fleet above them, but they had something far more dangerous. They had war. Not the sterilized, calculated battles of intergalactic conquest. Not the ceremonial victories of an empire that had not known true struggle for centuries. No, the humans fought like a species that had spent its entire existence perfecting the art of destruction. And somewhere, hidden beyond their scanners, they were preparing for the next strike. Varesh exhaled slowly. "Send in the war beasts. Deploy siege walkers to their last known artillery position. Find their weapons and eliminate them. Do it now." As the order was relayed, he kept his gaze locked on the planet below, the fires of battle flickering across its surface. He had underestimated these creatures. That mistake would not be repeated. The ground shook as the first M777 howitzer fired. A concussive boom rolled across the battlefield, followed by the distant whistling scream of the shell as it carved through the sky. Somewhere, unseen beyond the hills, an explosion bloomed. Dirt, metal, and flesh were torn apart in an instant. Captain Elias Carter didn't stop to watch. He already knew the results. The spotter teams were calling in fresh coordinates, and the gun crews worked like clockwork, reloading, adjusting, elevation and firing again. The artillery lines stretched along the ridge line, dug into reinforced positions, hidden beneath camouflaged netting. Drones overhead relayed movement patterns of the alien forces, feeding constant updates to targeting computers. The enemy had made a critical mistake. They had assumed human artillery was primitive. Elias wiped sweat from his brow, though the heat wasn't from exertion. It was the weight of the moment. The Zorak were unlike anything Earth had faced before, towering. Reptilian warriors clad in segmented battle armor, their weapons capable of turning steel to slag in seconds. They moved with ruthless efficiency, overwhelming defenses with plasma fire and relentless shock tactics. But they weren't invincible. "Fire mission, Grid Foxtrot 9-3. A voice crackled over the comms. Another round slammed into the breech of the howitzer, the crew working with mechanical precision. A final adjustment. A shout. Fire! And another shell was sent screaming toward the enemy. Elias turned his binoculars toward the valley below, where the Zorak war machines advanced. Even at this distance, he could see the shimmering distortion of their energy shields, the heavy plasma cannons mounted on their war beasts, the formations of infantry marching in perfect step, and then the howitzer rounds hit. The first detonations shattered the ground, sending shock waves through the enemy ranks. The Zorak had expected explosive impacts, but they had not anticipated the raw kinetic force behind them. The shells didn't simply explode, they obliterated. The airburst rounds fragmented, sending molten steel shards slicing through armor, tearing through shields like wet paper. Zorak war cries turned to screams of confusion. The plasma shields, designed to counter directed energy attacks, flickered wildly, failing to compensate for the sheer physical force they were being subjected to. Entire squads were thrown into the air, bodies crushed beneath the collapsing remains of their own walkers. Elias watched as a siege walker, a towering six-legged beast of war, took a direct hit to the side. The shell punched through its armor, detonating inside the chassis. A split second later, the machine erupted from within, fire and debris bursting outward as the crew inside was vaporized. The Zorak didn't understand. They had fought energy weapons, particle beams, electromagnetic pulses, but never this, never the brutal simplicity of steel and high explosives, refined over centuries of human warfare. A deep, guttural voice broke through intercepted comms. General Kordath, their weapons impossible. Adjust formation. Shields to full output. Advance. Break their line. Elias could almost hear the desperation beneath the command. The Zorak weren't used to taking losses, let alone in such numbers. Their formations shifted, adjusting to minimize exposure, moving with an efficiency only a species bred for war could achieve. It wouldn't save them. Fire mission, repeat fire mission, the spotters relayed. The howitzers roared again. The Zorak counterattack came swiftly. Plasma rounds rained down from their remaining walkers, scouring the landscape in search of artillery positions. Their troops surged forward, adapting, spreading out, attempting to move faster than the human targeting systems could compensate. It almost worked. A group of Zorak warriors broke through the outer defensive lines, sprinting up the slope with unnatural speed, their armor absorbing rifle fire as they closed the distance. Elias grabbed his rifle and dropped behind a sandbag barrier just as the first plasma bolts screamed overhead, searing the air with the scent of burning ozone. A machine gun opened up beside him, cutting down the first wave of attackers. A Zorak. Warrior took 3 direct hits to the chest before dropping, his massive frame hitting the dirt with a dull thud. Another lunged forward, only to be stopped mid-charge by an anti-materiel rifle, a single 50 caliber round punching through his skull. But still, they came. Elias squeezed the trigger, his rifle kicking against his shoulder as he sent a burst into the nearest enemy. The Zorak staggered but kept moving, his armor cracked but not broken. A second later, a grenade landed at his feet. The explosion sent him sprawling, limbs twisted at unnatural angles. The battle was close now, too close. The artillery was still firing, but Elias could feel the momentum shifting. The Zorak were adapting, pressing the assault with sheer brute force. They were willing to take losses if it meant closing the distance. And then the earth itself shook. Thunderous, bone-rattling explosion erupted behind enemy lines. Fire blossomed skyward as something massive detonated. A Zorak munition stockpile, hit by a precisely guided shell. The blast wave rippled across the battlefield, throwing warriors to the ground, disrupting their charge. A cheer went up from the human lines. The artillery was still in control. Elias caught his breath, reloading with quick, practiced movements. He glanced toward the comms officer, who was already relaying fresh targeting data. The war wasn't over, but the tide had shifted. The Zorak had believed themselves superior. They weren't, and soon they would understand why. The battlefield had fallen into a strange, eerie quiet. Smoke coiled through the ruins, the distant echo of artillery fire still rumbling like an angry god's growl, but the Zorak advance had halted. What had been a relentless assault had slowed, then fractured, then collapsed into something else entirely. Panic. Commander Varesh watched from the mobile command platform, his 4 eyes scanning the live battlefield feeds with something dangerously close to disbelief. He had led campaigns across a dozen star systems. He had seen resistance before, insurrections, last stands, desperate final gambits from species that knew they had no hope. But this was different. This wasn't desperation. This was methodical slaughter. Human artillery had rewritten the rules of engagement, and the Zorak didn't know how to adapt. The reports were undeniable. Whole platoons wiped out in seconds, armored divisions shattered by unseen forces, warriors crushed beneath the weight of a physics they had never learned to fear. Kordath stood beside him, his mandibles locked tight. The general's arrogance had eroded in the last few hours, replaced by a simmering frustration that now teetered on the edge of fear. "We've miscalculated," Kordath muttered. It was the closest thing to an admission of failure Varesh had ever heard from him. The feeds shifted, showing live footage from the forward units. The warriors who had survived the last barrage were shaken, disoriented. Their armor was scarred, their formations sloppy. They hesitated in the open, scanning the horizon, flinching at the distant thunder of the human guns. They weren't afraid of enemy soldiers. They weren't afraid of human weapons, not the kind they could see. They were afraid of the sky. Varesh had heard the intercepted transmissions, the frantic voices of his own troops before they were cut off. Some of them had started calling it the invisible death. It struck without warning, without pattern, without mercy. Warriors who had never once doubted Zorak's superiority now flinched at shadows, expecting death to fall from nowhere at any moment. "This is unsustainable," Kordath snapped. "We need to withdraw, regroup, reassess." Varesh exhaled slowly. He knew the truth of it. Their battle doctrine had failed them. The Zorak had built their war machine on overwhelming power, on direct confrontation, on breaking the enemy before they had a chance to resist. But the humans had refused to be broken. Instead, they had reshaped the battlefield into something entirely their own. He switched the feed to the war beast's advance. The towering siege creatures, once an unstoppable force, now stood immobilized, in the smoking ruins of what had been their greatest advantage. The Howitzer strikes had landed with pinpoint accuracy, rupturing their joints, collapsing their frames, leaving the monstrous engines of war as little more than burning wrecks. The warriors who had fought alongside them now milled about, leaderless, awaiting orders that no longer seemed to matter. Varesh turned to Kordath. "If we retreat, we invite humiliation. If we advance, we invite annihilation." Kordath clenched his fists. "Then we changed the terms of engagement." The plan came swiftly, a final push, an overwhelming brute force, charged to break the human artillery positions before another barrage could be called in. The remaining elite warriors, the strongest of the Zorak, would lead it. It was a desperate plan, but desperate plans had worked before. The order was given. In the trenches, Elias Carter watched the Zorak shift their formation. It was subtle, but he knew what was coming. The creatures had learned enough to realize they couldn't sit back and wait for the next bombardment. They were going to try and break the line, and they might actually succeed. Carter tapped his calm. "All positions, brace for ground assault. This is going to be ugly." The first wave came fast. Too fast. The Zorak warriors, now stripped of the caution that had slowed them before, surged forward with terrifying speed. There was no hesitation, no faltering. If they feared the invisible death, They had chosen to outrun it. Plasma bolts carved through the air. The ground trembled beneath their charge. Carter fired, dropping one of the creatures mid-stride, but another took its place. The trench line erupted in chaos. A Zorak warrior vaulted over the barrier, landing just feet away. Carter barely had time to register the glint of a blade before instinct took over. He sidestepped, fired twice, and watched the alien crumple, its armor splintering under the force of the rounds. Another was already on him. He ducked, feeling the heat of a plasma blade slice through the air where his head had been a second ago. Then, from above, whistling, Carter hit the ground just as the howitzer rounds landed. The sky cracked open, fire and steel raining down in perfect, deadly precision. The Zorak charge dissolved in an instant. One moment they had been unstoppable, the next they were simply gone, torn apart by forces they could never hope to counter. He pushed himself up, chest heaving. Around him, the trench was littered with bodies, human and Zorak alike, but the line had held. Varesh watched the last of the feeds cut to static. He had no words. The charge had been a slaughter. His best warriors had vanished beneath human firepower, their remains scattered across the battlefield. For the first time in his life, he understood defeat. Not just in theory, not as a possibility, as an inevitability. The Zorak were losing, and if they stayed, they would be wiped out. The Zorak fleet hung in orbit, silent, motionless. For the first time in recorded history, the warlords of conquest had no orders to give, no planets to subjugate, no victory to declare. The battle had been lost, and the weight of that failure pressed down on every commander still breathing. Varesh stood at the bridge of the Vindicator, staring down at the scarred surface of Earth. Fires still smoldered where plasma bombardments had rained destruction, but the planet remained defiant. More than that, it remained victorious. The retreat order had been given 3 hours ago. It had been the only choice left. The ground forces had been shattered, their formations reduced to disorganized remnants, their morale crushed beyond repair. The elite warriors who had led the final charge had been obliterated before they had even reached the enemy's artillery. Varesh had always believed in the supremacy of his kind, in the inevitability of Zorak dominance. He had been wrong, and now the humans had sent a message. It had arrived through a simple transmission, broadcasted across all frequencies. No demands, no ultimatums, just a single grainy image, an artillery shell painted with rough, bold lettering. Welcome to Earth, nothing more. It had been enough. Kordath stood beside him, shoulders rigid, mandibles locked tight. He had barely spoken since the retreat order. The fire that had once burned in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by something cold and unreadable. They didn't fight like an empire, he muttered. Varesh turned to him. No, empires fought for conquest, for expansion, for dominance. The humans had fought for survival. They had waged war not as conquerors, but as creatures who had known destruction, who had shaped their entire existence around the art of killing before they had ever set foot among the stars. They should not have won. Kordath's voice was hoarse, bitter. We were superior in every way. Varesh exhaled slowly. Were we? There was no answer to that. Below, the earth remained, battered but unbroken. The Zorak had come expecting submission. Instead, they had learned fear. The war was over, and Varesh knew with chilling certainty that the humans had just begun.